plague was one of the most devastating disasters in human history. Yet instead of compassion, many victims found themselves met with suspicion, cruelty, and punishment. In medieval Europe, where understanding of disease was primitive and religion often dictated interpretation, sickness was not seen as an accident of nature, but as a consequence of sin or divine wrath. Those who fell ill or were even suspected of carrying the plague were often treated as if they themselves were the cause of the catastrophe. Rather than receiving aid, they became scapegoats, blamed, beaten, shunned, or even executed in their time of greatest need. When plague broke out in the 14th century, fear spread faster than the disease itself. Families, terrified of infection, abandoned sick relatives, leaving them to die alone. Communities, unable to explain the rapid deaths, turned to superstition and religious fervor. Victims were thought to be marked by God's judgment, punished for their sins, or even cursed by the devil. This belief created a justification for cruelty. If plague was divine punishment, then those who bore its marks, the swellings, the fevers, the blackened skin, were not fellow sufferers but walking reminders of sin. Helping them seemed not only dangerous but blasphemous. Authorities sometimes enforced this cruelty. In some cities, the sick were rounded up and forced out of town, beaten if they resisted. Guards patrolled streets to drive away anyone suspected of carrying disease. In certain regions, corpses were left unburied for days, as officials feared touching them would bring divine punishment on themselves. The dying were treated as dangerous outcasts, rather than human beings in need of dignity. Accounts from the Black Death describe how victims were thrown into mass pits with little ceremony, their families too frightened or too powerless to intervene. The violence extended beyond neglect in their desperation to control the plague. Some communities resorted to beating or whipping plague victims, believing that punishment could purge the disease. Religious zealots argued that plague was a result of immorality, and that inflicting suffering on the afflicted was a way to cleanse them. Others simply lashed out in panic, striking those who showed signs of illness, as if violence could protect them from infection. This twisted logic turned the sick into targets, their suffering multiplied by cruelty. In towns across Europe, there are recorded cases of victims being accused of deliberately spreading the plague through witchcraft, poison, or devilish plots. Once suspicion took hold, mobs often took matters into their own hands. People showing symptoms were beaten or killed outright, not only to stop the disease, but to appease the community's terror in these moments. The plague was not just a medical crisis, but a collapse of humanity itself. Compassion gave way to fear, and fear transformed into violence. The irony is that many of these punishments accelerated the devastation, abandoning the sick left infections unchecked. As corpses in homes and streets spread disease further, beating or killing plague victims did nothing to stop contagion, but deepened the trauma of those left behind. Instead of organizing care or sanitation, many communities fell back on cruelty, ensuring that the plague's toll was measured not only in deaths from illness, but in the violence inflicted on the dying. This instinct to blame rather than help reveals how societies often respond under pressure. In moments of catastrophe, fear can erode empathy, turning communities inward and hostile. The plague laid bare the fragile threads of compassion that bound people together. Under the weight of death and uncertainty, those threads snapped, leaving cruelty in their place. Victims, already ravaged by disease, became scapegoats for the terror of the healthy. The legacy of this cruelty is as disturbing as the plague itself. Accounts from the period describe not only the horror of disease, but the despair of abandonment, the terror of being beaten or cast out, the knowledge that society saw the sick not as people to be saved, but as threats to be eliminated. It is a legacy that reminds us that the greatest danger in times of crisis is not always the disaster itself, but the way fear can strip away our humanity. When plague swept across Europe, authorities turned to quarantine as a desperate measure to halt the spread. In principle, the idea was sound. Separating the sick from the healthy could slow contagion. But in practice, quarantine often became cruelty, a punishment rather than protection. Instead of being cared for, countless families were locked inside their homes, doors nailed shut by officials, leaving both the sick and the healthy trapped together to suffer and die. What was intended as a safeguard often became a death sentence. The concept of quarantine originated in Italian port cities during the Black Death of the 14th century. Ships arriving from plague-ridden regions were required to wait 40 days, 40 giorni, before passengers could disembark on the surface. This was a pragmatic step, but on land, the practice quickly took a darker turn. Whole neighborhoods suspected of infection were sealed off, patrolled by guards who prevented anyone from leaving. In towns from Florence to London, families awoke to find their doors barred with wooden planks or iron locks, effectively transforming their homes into prison. For those inside, the experience was terrifying. Once a house was sealed, no aid came in. Food was scarce, water limited, and medical help non-existent. Families were left to care for their sick in suffocating conditions, watching as loved ones died, one by one, knowing they too might soon succumb. In many cases, survivors emerged days or weeks later to find themselves alone. Their families dead, their homes marked with the stench of decay. The cruelty was not only in the disease itself, but in the enforced isolation that turned homes into tombs. This harsh form of quarantine blurred the line between public health and punishment. Instead of viewing victims as people in need of help, authorities treated them as threats to be contained at all costs. Guards stationed outside the sealed homes were ordered to shoot or beat anyone who tried to escape. Dogs and cats, believed to spread plague, were killed en masse in the streets. In some cities, entire districts were abandoned, their residents forcibly confined or driven away. Quarantine became not a shield but a weapon, used to sacrifice the few for the sake of the many. The cruelty was compounded by inequality. Wealthier families could sometimes bribe officials to avoid confinement or flee to country estates, leaving the poor to face the harshest restrictions. In crowded urban districts, where multiple families shared small houses, a single suspected infection meant dozens trapped together in unbearable conditions. The poor bore the brunt of quarantine, their suffering magnified by poverty and neglect. For them, quarantine was not protection but abandonment, a grim reminder that in times of crisis, survival often depended on wealth and status. Stories from plague years describe scenes of unimaginable despair. In London's outbreak of 1665, watchmen patrolled the streets at night, ensuring that no one left their sealed homes. Families cried for help through barred windows, begging for food, medicine, or release. Priests refused to enter plague houses, leaving victims to die without comfort or prayer. In some cases, corpses piled inside for days before carts came to collect them, spreading terror as neighbors heard the groans of the dying next door. Quarantine, intended as a wall against disease, became a wall against compassion. Yet perhaps the most horrifying aspect of these quarantines was the way they stripped people of dignity. To be locked away was to be branded as tainted, a danger to society. Healthy individuals sealed inside with the sick endured the same fate, punished simply for proximity. Quarantine marked families as cursed, their homes stigmatized long after the plague passed. Survivors emerged not only with grief, but with the shame of being treated as pariahs, avoided by neighbors who feared lingering contamination. The cruelty of quarantine reveals a deeper truth about how societies respond to crisis. Fear of contagion turned neighbors into jailers, officials into executioners, and homes into prisons. The line between protection and punishment vanished, replaced by a brutal calculus that valued containment over humanity. In the end, the plague destroyed not only lives but the bonds of trust and compassion that hold communities together. Quarantine meant to save, often condemned. The legacy of these cruel quarantines lingers as a reminder of the dangers of fear-driven policy. It shows how quickly protection can become oppression, how easily the sick can be abandoned in the name of safety. The plague killed millions, but the cruelty of quarantine ensured that many died not only from disease, but from the isolation, neglect, and despair of being locked away, unseen and unheard. One of the darkest aspects of plague history is how entire communities sought scapegoats to explain what they could not understand. Lacking medical knowledge, terrified by the speed of death, and desperate for answers, people turned against minorities, outsiders, and anyone who seemed different. Instead of uniting in compassion, societies fractured, unleashing massacres, expulsions, and torture upon those falsely blamed for spreading disease. The plague revealed not only the vulnerability of the human body, but also the cruelty of the human mind when consumed by fear. During the Black Death of the 14th century, Jewish communities across Europe became the primary scapegoats. Rumors spread that Jews had poisoned wells, spread powders, or invoked dark sorcery to bring the plague. These lies took hold with frightening speed, fueled by centuries of prejudice and religious tension. Pogroms erupted from Spain to Germany. In Strasbourg in 1349, nearly 2,000 Jews were rounded up and burned alive in a single day. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out, not by plague, but by the fury of their neighbors. Survivors fled eastward, their lives uprooted by violence. As deadly as the disease itself, foreigners and travelers were also targeted. Strangers arriving in towns were suspected of carrying plague deliberately, accused of being spies or agents of the devil. Merchants, pilgrims, and beggars often faced harassment, imprisonment, or execution. Their presence was enough to provoke suspicion, for in times of panic, difference itself became dangerous. Outsiders bore the brunt of fear, their suffering adding to the toll of the epidemic. Even within communities, scapegoating took brutal forms. Women, especially healers and midwives, were accused of witchcraft and blamed for spreading disease. Their herbs and remedies, misunderstood in an age of superstition, became evidence of diabolical power. Torture, forced confessions, and executions followed. In some towns, lepers and the disabled were also persecuted, their conditions seen as outward signs of sin or contagion. The plague's cruelty was not only biological, it was social, targeting the most vulnerable and casting them as enemies. Religious fervor fueled the violence. Flagellant movements, groups of zealots who whipped themselves in public to atone for sin, often turned their fury on Jews and other minorities. They claimed that purging sinners from society would end God's wrath. Town leaders, fearing unrest or eager to deflect blame from themselves, sometimes sanctioned massacres, turning prejudice into policy. What should have been an effort to heal communities became campaigns of brutality. The scapegoating was not limited to killings. Expulsions forced thousands into exile. Jewish families were driven from cities across Spain, France, and the German states, often stripped of property and livelihood. Many wandered in search of safety, only to find suspicion waiting wherever they arrived. For those left behind, life was marked by isolation, their communities stigmatized as sources of contagion. In many places, entire Jewish populations vanished, not because of plague deaths, but because of organized persecution. What made these punishments especially horrifying was their futility. None of the massacres, burnings, or expulsions slowed the spread of disease. Banishing foreigners did not halt contagion. Torturing women and healers did not heal the sick. The violence achieved nothing but destruction, adding human cruelty to natural catastrophe. Yet, in the grip of fear, logic gave way to rage, and rage demanded victims. The scapegoating left scars that lasted for generations. Jewish communities never fully recovered in many parts of Europe. The memory of betrayal and massacre deepened distrust between neighbors, embedding prejudice into cultural memory. Survivors carried trauma not only from the plague itself, but from the knowledge that their friends and rulers had turned on them in their darkest hour. The plague became not only a story of pestilence, but of betrayal, where humanity failed itself as completely as medicine failed the sick. The story of scapegoats during plague years serves as one of history's most disturbing lessons. Fear can twist communities into mobs, transforming neighbors into executioners. In seeking someone to blame, societies destroyed their own, multiplying suffering rather than easing it. The plague's death toll was horrific, but the massacres and persecutions carried out in its shadow made the tragedy even greater. It was not only a biological disaster, but a moral one, exposing how easily fear and prejudice can unleash horrors as devastating as any disease. When plague swept through Europe, killing millions with terrifying speed, many believed it was not a natural disaster, but divine punishment. To the medieval mind, the plague was not carried by fleas or spread by rats. It was the wrath of God unleashed on a sinful world. This interpretation transformed the fight against disease into a campaign against perceived immorality. Communities sought to appease God's anger not through medicine or sanitation, but through punishment. Whippings, torture, and public executions became rituals of purification, turning fear of disease into spectacles of suffering. Flagellants embodied this grim response. These were bands of zealots who roamed from town to town, whipping themselves in public squares as penance for humanity's sins. Bare-backed, they lashed themselves with spiked cords until blood ran down their skin. Crowds gathered to watch as the flagellants marched through streets, chanting prayers and hymns between blows. Their message was simple. If sin had brought the plague, only suffering could drive it away. The movement spread quickly during outbreaks, its bloody processions both horrifying and mesmerizing. Yet rather than bringing relief, their presence often spread panic, reinforcing the belief that only violence and pain could appease God. Communities, inspired by the flagellants or driven by their own fears, turned punishment outward. Suspected sinners, women accused of sexual immorality, gamblers, drunkards, or anyone deemed unrighteous, were publicly whipped or tortured as examples. Leaders believed that purging sin from society would end the plague. In some cases, victims were paraded through the streets, flogged before jeering crowds, or forced to endure humiliating rituals of penance. Pain became a form of currency, traded for the hope of survival. Executions were also justified as acts of purification. Those accused of witchcraft, heresy, or spreading plague through sorcery were tortured into confessions and burned alive. Public burnings and hangings were staged as both punishment and deterrent, spectacles that drew crowds seeking reassurance that their community was taking action. The bodies of the condemned became offerings to a wrathful God, consumed by flames in hopes of sparing the rest. These executions did nothing to stop the disease, but they provided a sense of control in a world unraveling. Children were not spared from these cruelties. In some regions, parents whipped their children, believing that the innocent suffering of the young would soften God's anger. This tragic belief showed how deeply fear had warped compassion, turning love itself into cruelty. Families inflicted pain on their own in the desperate hope of survival, sacrificing tenderness to superstition. The plague eroded not only health but the very instincts that bind families together. The public nature of these punishments made them powerful tools of social control. Crowds watched as bodies were scourged, as men and women were executed, as flagellants bled in the streets. These scenes reinforced the message that sin was the true contagion, that only punishment could cure the plague. Fear and faith merged into theater, where suffering was both spectacle and sermon. The rituals united communities in shared horror, but also deepened the scars of trauma. These punishments reflected a broader truth about medieval society. In times of crisis, fear often demanded visible sacrifice. The unseen enemy of plague could not be fought directly, but sinners could be whipped, witches could be burned, and children could be beaten. By punishing bodies, communities believed they were purging evil itself. The cruelty was justified as necessary, transforming violence into virtue. Yet beneath the prayers and processions lay desperation, a futile attempt to control the uncontrollable. The legacy of these public punishments is haunting. They reveal how fear of death can strip away compassion, replacing it with ritualized cruelty. The plague killed millions, but the punishments inflicted in its shadow magnified the suffering. Innocent men, women, and children endured torture, not because it saved lives, but because it gave terrified communities the illusion of action. The true horror lies not only in the disease itself, but in the way it turned neighbors into tormentors, transforming fear into brutality. In the end, the plague passed, but the scars remained. Survivors remembered not only the stench of death and the silence of empty streets, but the cries of the punished, the sight of blood in public squares, and the flames that consumed their neighbors. The punishments meant to cleanse society left it stained with cruelty, a legacy that reminds us how fear and faith, when twisted by desperation, can make suffering seem like salvation. The plague was not only a biological disaster, it was a moral one. While the disease claimed millions of lives, the punishments inflicted in its shadow left behind wounds just as deep, shaping societies long after the epidemics ended. The legacy of the plague was not simply measured in graves, but in the fear, mistrust, and injustice that it carved into human history. Instead of uniting communities in compassion, the plague fractured them, teaching lessons of cruelty that lingered across generations. Fear was its most enduring gift. In every outbreak, the sight of swelling buboes, blackened skin, and sudden death instilled terror that spread faster than the disease itself. But the responses, beatings of the sick, cruel quarantines, scapegoating of minorities, and public tortures, transformed that fear into something deeper. It became a cultural inheritance, a memory etched into families and communities. Survivors carried stories of abandonment, betrayal, and violence. Children who watched their parents sealed into plague houses or saw neighbors burned as scapegoats grew up with fear woven into their understanding of life. Even long after the epidemics faded, the terror endured, shaping how societies approached sickness, difference, and danger. The injustice of plague punishments was equally lasting. Entire communities, especially Jews, were decimated not by plague alone, but by massacres, expulsions, and torture. Generations of families lost homes, livelihoods, and lives because fear demanded scapegoats. This injustice lived on in the structures of discrimination that followed. Prejudice deepened and laws targeting minorities found justification in memories of plague years. The disease ended, but the divisions it carved persisted, leaving scars that reshaped Europe's cultural and political landscape. Even those who survived the punishments bore the weight of injustice. Families branded as plague carriers or sinners found themselves ostracized for years. Survivors of quarantines emerged stigmatized, their homes marked, their reputations tarnished. Children carried the shame of their parents' punishments, their identities shaped by the suspicion of others. Injustice lived not only in the moment of punishment, but in the lingering stigma that shadowed generations. The legacy also included mistrust between rulers and ruled, between neighbors, even between family members. The harsh quarantines, enforced with violence, eroded confidence in authority. Communities remembered that officials had nailed doors shut, condemning families to die inside. They remembered that priests had abandoned plague houses, refusing to administer last rites. They remembered neighbors who had denounced one another, eager to deflect suspicion. These betrayals weakened the bonds that held societies together, replacing trust with suspicion. In times of crisis, people remembered the plague, and they remembered how cruelty had reigned. Yet within this legacy of fear and injustice lies a warning that has echoed through history. The plague revealed how quickly fear can transform into violence, how easily compassion can collapse under the weight of panic. It showed that societies under pressure often look not for solutions, but for scapegoats, not for healing, but for punishment. These lessons are not relics of the past. They remain relevant in every era of crisis. Whenever fear spreads, so too does the temptation to sacrifice the vulnerable for the illusion of safety. The injustice of plague punishments also reshaped cultural memory. Writers, chroniclers, and survivors recorded the horrors, ensuring that the cruelty was not forgotten. Their accounts reveal not only the scale of death, but the scale of betrayal. Neighbors turning on neighbors, communities abandoning their weakest, rulers enforcing cruelty in the name of survival. These memories became part of the broader story of human resilience, but also human failure, reminding later generations that the true measure of a society is found not in how it thrives, but in how it responds to catastrophe. The plague left behind empty villages, overgrown fields, and silent streets. But it also left behind a darker inheritance, the memory of punishments that compounded suffering. Fear became generational, mistrust became cultural, and injustice became structural. These were the invisible scars, no less real than the graves that dotted the land. The legacy of the plague, then, is not only a story of death, but a story of choices. Choices made in fear, choices that inflicted cruelty, choices that echo still. It reminds us that in every crisis, humanity stands at a crossroads, to let fear dictate injustice, or to seek compassion even in chaos. The plague punishments show us the cost of choosing fear, and their legacy endures, a haunting reminder that the greatest horrors are not always born of nature, but of ourselves.